When a retired teacher's backyard became an unexpected healing sanctuary, no one could have predicted how a single garden would transform an entire community, one broken soul at a time. But that's exactly what happened in the quiet suburb of Millbrook Heights, where hope took root in the most unlikely of places. The pristine white walls of Dr. Anderson's office seemed to mock Martha Wilson's despair. Another prescription? Her weathered hands trembled as she held the paper, the amount making her heart sink. $348, almost a quarter of her monthly pension. The black digits on the prescription seemed to dance before her eyes, a cruel reminder of how life had changed since the pandemic. "I really think this will help with the anxiety, Martha." Dr. Anderson leaned forward in his ergonomic chair, his voice carrying that practiced blend of professional concern and detachment. The same tone she had used countless times during parent-teacher conferences in her 32 years of teaching. "The isolation you're experiencing since COVID, it's more common than you might think." Martha nodded mechanically, her fingers unconsciously smoothing the wrinkles of her carefully pressed navy dress. The one she always wore to important appointments, the one Tom had bought her for their last anniversary before he. She pushed the thought away, focusing instead on the potted plant in the corner of Dr. Anderson's office. Its leaves were dusty, neglected. Tom would have never allowed that. "Common," she echoed, the word tasting bitter in her mouth. There was nothing common about losing your husband of 43 years to COVID. Nothing ordinary about watching your vibrant community turn into a collection of closed doors and drawn curtains. Nothing routine about forgetting how to live. The digital display on the wall flashed 2:47 p.m. Martha remembered when that same time meant watching her fifth grader's eyes light up during afternoon story time. Now it marked another 15-minute slot in Dr. Anderson's schedule, another prescription, another Band-Aid on a wound too deep for medicine to reach. Outside in the parking lot, Martha sat in her meticulously maintained 2010 Toyota Camry, the prescription paper burning a hole in her purse. Through the windshield, she watched the autumn leaves dance across the asphalt, red and gold performers in nature's ballet. A young mother hurried past, wrestling with a stroller and a phone, her mask slightly askew. Their eyes met briefly, but the younger woman quickly looked away, increasing her pace. 3 years ago, Martha would have offered to help, would have cooed at the baby, maybe shared a story about her own experiences with stroller wrangling. Now, the moment passed like so many others, lost to the new normal of averted gazes and careful distances. She turned the key in the ignition, but didn't pull out immediately. Instead, her mind wandered to her classroom at Millbrook Elementary. Room 207, with its alphabet border and the reading corner she'd decorated each season. The wall of student artwork that had grown more impressive each year. The little garden box outside her window where she taught her students about photosynthesis and patience. A sharp rap on her window startled her from her reverie. Mrs. Chen from across the street was hurrying past, barely managing a tight smile through her mask. 2 years ago, they would have chatted for hours about their grandchildren, exchanged recipes, planned their seasonal decorations together. Now, their only communication was a hesitant wave through window panes, like ships passing in a foggy harbor, each too afraid to sound their horn. The drive home felt longer than usual, each familiar landmark a reminder of what had changed. The community center, once bustling with senior activities, stood silent, its windows dark. The park where she used to read to her students during spring sessions was empty save for a few scattered pigeons. Even the local diner, where she and Tom had shared Sunday breakfasts for decades, had a "for lease" sign that seemed to grow larger each time she passed. Millbrook Heights had always been proud of its small-town charm, its tight-knit community. "Where everybody knows your name," Tom used to joke, though it had been true. Now it felt more like "where everybody used to know your name," before masks hid smiles and fear built walls higher than any picket fence. As Martha pulled into her driveway, she noticed Tommy Matthews, the 8-year-old from 2 doors down, sitting alone on his front steps. His mother, Sarah, a single parent working 2 jobs since her husband left, was probably still at the hospital where she'd picked up extra shifts in the COVID ward. The boy's fingers moved in their usual patterns, counting, always counting. Martha remembered reading about autism during her teaching years, how structure and routine helped. She wondered what the pandemic's chaos had done to his carefully ordered world. The garage door hummed closed behind her car, sealing her in her own private fortress of solitude. The house was exactly as she'd left it, immaculate, organized, and utterly lifeless. The silence pressed against her eardrums like cotton wool, broken only by the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a lawnmower somewhere down the street. She placed the prescription on her kitchen counter, next to the others she hadn't filled. The stack was growing, like accusations in paper form. Depression, anxiety, insomnia, labels for the holes in her heart that no pill seemed able to fill. Through her kitchen window, Martha could see her backyard. The once pristine garden that Tom had maintained with military precision, old habits from his Navy days never quite faded, had become a tangle of overgrown grass and dying perennials. She hadn't been able to bring herself to touch it since he passed. It felt like disturbing a memorial. But today, something about the wild abandon of the garden caught her attention differently. Perhaps it was the way the late afternoon sun caught the dewdrops on the overgrown grass, turning them into tiny prisms. Or maybe it was the memory of Tommy, sitting alone on those steps, counting a world that no longer made sense. Martha pressed her hand against the cool glass of the window, leaving a print that would have driven her cleaning habits crazy just months ago. Beyond her reflection, past the tangled grass and forgotten flowers, she could just make out the shed where Tom kept his gardening tools. She hadn't opened it since. A sudden gust of wind swept through the yard, making the overgrown grass wave like the sea. For a moment, just a moment, it looked like something was reaching up from the earth itself, beckoning her to come outside. Martha Wilson stood at her kitchen window, watching as shadows lengthened across her abandoned garden. The prescription paper on her counter seemed to whisper its $348 solution, but for the first time in months, another voice, one that sounded remarkably like Tom's, was whispering something else. Something about growth and healing, and how sometimes the best medicine doesn't come in orange bottles with childproof caps. She reached for her coat. The garden, wild and waiting, beckoned. The morning sun cast long shadows through Martha's kitchen window as she stared at her monthly budget spread across the dining table. The neat columns of numbers, written in her precise teacher's handwriting, told a story more stark than any novel she'd ever read to her students. Pension, utilities, groceries, and now these prescriptions. It all added up to a reality she wasn't quite ready to face. "You'd know what to do, wouldn't you, Tom?" she whispered to the empty chair across the table. The chair still sat at the exact angle he'd left it in that final morning, when he'd kissed her goodbye before heading to the grocery store. Who could have known that a simple shopping trip would lead to? The sharp trill of her phone cut through her thoughts. Martha's heart leaped, then fell just as quickly when she saw it wasn't her son Michael's weekly call from Seattle. Just another automated reminder about her upcoming medical appointment. She silenced it with trembling fingers, remembering when her phone used to buzz with messages from fellow teachers, dinner invitations from neighbors, pictures of grandchildren. Through the window, she watched Mrs. Chen's meticulous morning routine next door. The elderly Chinese woman, once the neighborhood's most celebrated gardener, now limited her outdoor activities to precisely 3 minutes of mail collection each day at 10:15 a.m. Martha remembered the Lunar New Year celebrations Mrs. Chen used to host, her backyard transformed into a festival of lanterns and laughter. Now that same backyard lay as dormant as Martha's own, another casualty of the times. "Morning, Mrs. Wilson." A cheerful voice startled her. Sarah Matthews, Tommy's mother, was speed-walking past the house in her hospital scrubs, car keys jangling in her hand. Dark circles under her eyes betrayed another night shift at the COVID ward. Tommy's sitter canceled again. "I don't suppose?" She let the question hang in the air, hope and desperation mingling in her voice. Martha felt her throat tighten. A year ago, she would have jumped at the chance to help with Tommy. After all, she'd spent 3 decades working with children, including several on the autism spectrum. But now, "I'm sorry," she managed, hating the way Sarah's face fell. "I'm not feeling quite up to it today." The words tasted like betrayal in her mouth. No, I completely understand," Sarah rushed to assure her, already backing away. "Maybe another time." They both knew there wouldn't be another time. Not really. Martha watched as Sarah hurried to her car, phone pressed to her ear, no doubt calling down her list of backup sitters. Tommy appeared in his doorway, fingers moving in their familiar counting pattern. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. His world measured in sets of 5, trying to make order out of chaos. The rest of Millbrook Heights was slowly coming to life, but not in the way Martha remembered. Gone were the morning coffee clusters of retirees on front porches, the carpool coordination between young parents, the jogging groups that used to parade past her house like colorful chains of determination. Instead, people moved like ghosts between their houses and cars, masked faces turned down, avoiding eye contact. The community bulletin board outside the local market, once plastered with announcements for bake sales and book clubs, now displayed only faded COVID guidelines and a single, optimistic flyer for a virtual quilting circle that had never quite taken off. Martha's gaze drifted to the framed photo on her mantle, her last class photo from Millbrook Elementary. 24 bright faces beamed at the camera, gathered around her like eager seedlings reaching for the sun. She'd retired just months before the pandemic, planning to spend her golden years substitute teaching and volunteering. "You've got too much love to give to just stop teaching," Tom had said. Now those plans, like so many others, felt like artifacts from another lifetime. The sound of breaking glass shattered the morning quiet. Martha rushed to her front window to see Mr. Peterson, the retired accountant from number 43, standing amid the remains of his dropped groceries. His cane had slipped on the wet sidewalk, and now he stood frozen, looking at the mess as if it were a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. Martha's hand was on her coat before she consciously made the decision to help. But then she hesitated. The familiar tightness gripped her chest, the burning sensation that accompanied thoughts of going outside, of getting too close, of breathing the same air as others. Dr. Anderson had a name for it: post-COVID anxiety disorder. Martha had a simpler name: fear. Through the window, she watched as Mr. Peterson slowly, painfully began to pick up his scattered purchases. Each bend of his arthritic knees was a small battle, each reach for a rolling can a victory of will over body. Other neighbors peeked through their windows, their faces mirrors of Martha's own paralysis. Finally, young Kevin from the delivery service that had sprung up during lockdown jogged over to help. Martha watched as the young man efficiently gathered the spilled groceries, keeping a careful distance as he helped Mr. Peterson reorganize his bags. The entire interaction lasted less than 2 minutes, conducted with minimal words and maximum space, a perfectly choreographed dance of modern caution. Back at her dining table, Martha's budget sheets seemed to mock her. The numbers hadn't changed, but something else had, the weight of what they represented. It wasn't just about affording prescriptions anymore. It was about the cost of isolation, the price of fear, the toll of watching your community crumble one dropped grocery bag at a time. Her fingers traced the column labeled medical expenses, remembering Tom's voice. "Numbers never tell the whole story, honey. It's the people behind them that matter." He'd said that during their first years of marriage, when they were both teachers struggling to make ends meet. They'd survived then by leaning on their community. Babysitting exchanges, carpools, shared gardens. Gardens! Martha's eyes drifted to her backyard again. The morning sun had risen higher now, illuminating the tangled mess of what had once been Tom's pride and joy. Somewhere under those weeds were the roses he'd tenderly cultivated, the tomato beds that had supplied half the neighborhood with summer salads, the herb garden that had made their house smell like a Provence kitchen. A sudden movement caught her eye. A cardinal, brilliant red against the overgrown green, had landed on the old bird feeder that still hung, empty and neglected, from the maple tree. The bird cocked its head as if asking a question, then flew away when no answer came. Martha remembered how that bird feeder had once been a gathering point for the neighborhood children. They'd kept a notebook by the window, tracking different species, learning about migration patterns. Tommy Matthews, in his first weeks after moving to the street, had spent hours watching the birds, his counting finally finding purpose in cataloging their visits. The memory hit her with physical force. Tommy, age 6, speaking his first full sentence while watching a chickadee at that feeder. "Bird came back," he'd said, his mother crying tears of joy while Martha and Tom exchanged knowing smiles. They'd all been together then, a community woven tight as a garden trellis. Now that same community was unraveling, pulled apart by invisible threads of fear and isolation. The prescriptions on her counter offered chemical comfort, but as Martha watched another neighbor hurry past her house, head down and mask firmly in place, she wondered if perhaps they were all taking the wrong medicine. The cardinal returned, this time with a mate. They both perched on the empty feeder, their bright presence like a splash of paint on a faded canvas. Martha found herself reaching for her phone, finger hovering over Michael's number in Seattle. He would tell her she was being foolish, that at her age she should focus on staying safe, staying inside. But Tom's voice in her memory was louder. "Sometimes, honey, the best way to heal yourself is to help others grow." Martha stood up, her budget sheets forgotten. She had 32 years of teaching experience, a yard full of possibilities, and a community in desperate need of connection. Perhaps it was time to start a different kind of classroom. The cardinal pair took flight as Martha walked to her back door for the first time in months. Her hand trembled as it reached for the knob, but her voice was steady as she whispered to herself, "Time to grow something new, Tom." The old shed door protested with a rusty groan as Martha pushed it open for the first time in 18 months. A shaft of sunlight cut through the dusty air, illuminating dancing motes like tiny stars in a forgotten galaxy. The familiar scent of aged wood, rusted metal, and dormant soil rushed over her like a wave of memories. "Oh, Tom," she whispered, her voice catching in her throat. Everything was exactly as he'd left it. Tom's gardening tools hung in perfect military precision on the pegboard wall, a general's arsenal for battling weeds and nurturing life. Each implement bore his distinctive touch. Handles worn smooth by years of use, blades maintained with sailor's care, and every one marked with his neat block letters. TW. Her fingers traced the outline of a trowel, leaving clear tracks in the dust. How many Saturday mornings had she watched him from the kitchen window, this very tool in his strong hands, carefully transplanting his beloved roses. "Every flower has its own personality, honey," he'd say. "You just have to listen to what they're telling you." Something caught her eye on the workbench, Tom's gardening journal, its leather cover cracked and faded but still sturdy. Martha's hands trembled as she picked it up, unexpectedly heavy with years of notes, diagrams, and pressed flowers. A paper slipped from between its pages, floating to the floor like an autumn leaf. She bent to retrieve it, recognizing Tom's precise handwriting immediately. Spring Planning 2020. Replace herb garden border. Start butterfly sanctuary for Martha's class. Build raised beds for Mrs. Chen's arthritis. Design sensory garden section. Check with Sarah about Tommy's preferences. New bird feeding station. Never got to finish these, but maybe someone will. The words blurred as tears filled Martha's eyes. Even in his planning, Tom had thought of everyone else, her students, their neighbors, the community. The list was dated just 3 days before he'd made that fatal trip to the grocery store. A sudden flutter of movement made her look up. Through the shed's dusty window, she could see the cardinal pair had returned to the empty bird feeder. They seemed to be watching her, their bright presence like a sign from a universe that perhaps hadn't forgotten them after all. Martha wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving a smudge of dust on her cheek. The teacher in her, the part that had spent 3 decades helping young minds bloom, began to stir. She looked around the shed with new eyes, seeing not just tools and memories, but possibilities. The pegboard wall suddenly reminded her of her classroom's reading progress chart, each tool like a marker of growth waiting to happen. The workbench, with its scattered seed packets and dormant bulbs, could have been her old project table where countless science experiments had unfolded. She picked up a packet of butterfly bush seeds, their expiration date long past but still potentially viable, much like her own dormant purpose. "Seeds are patient," Tom always said. "They'll wait for the right time to grow." With surprising steadiness, Martha began to gather tools: the trowel, pruning shears, Tom's favorite spade. Each item she selected felt like assembling a lesson plan, preparing to teach a class about life and renewal. She hadn't realized how much she'd missed that feeling of preparation, of possibility. Outside, the autumn air held that peculiar clarity unique to October mornings. Martha stood at the edge of her overgrown garden, tools in hand, Tom's journal tucked under her arm. The task before her seemed overwhelming. The once neat beds were now a jungle of weeds, the rose bushes had grown wild and thorny, and the vegetable patch was a tangle of expired dreams. But something else caught her attention. Beneath the chaos, there were signs of resilience. A few of Tom's roses had not only survived, but thrived in their untamed state. The herb garden, though overgrown, still released waves of fragrance when the wind brushed through it. And there, in the corner where the butterfly garden should have been, wildflowers had taken root on their own, their bright faces turned toward the sun in stubborn defiance of neglect. "Start small," she could hear Tom's voice coaching her. "Every garden begins with a single cleared patch." Martha knelt down, her knees protesting against the damp earth, and began to clear a small area near the old bird feeder. As she worked, muscle memory took over, the familiar rhythm of pulling weeds, turning soil, making order from chaos. It felt like waking up from a long sleep. The morning wore on, and Martha lost herself in the work. She didn't notice when Mrs. Chun appeared at her fence, watching silently. Didn't see when Sarah Matthews paused on her way to her car, Tommy's hand in hers, both of them observing the unexpected activity in the Wilson yard. Didn't register when Mr. Peterson shuffled to his mailbox for the second time that day, something he hadn't done in months, just to get a better look at what was happening. It wasn't until she heard a small voice behind her that Martha realized she had an audience. The birds came back. She turned to find Tommy Matthews standing at the garden's edge, his fingers moving in their usual counting pattern, but his eyes fixed on the cardinal pair that had returned yet again to the feeder. Sarah stood a few steps behind him, surprise and concern warring on her face. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Wilson," Sarah began, reaching for Tommy's shoulder. "He got away from me when I was locking the door." "He's right," Martha heard herself say, her teacher's voice emerging naturally, like a perennial pushing through spring soil. "The birds did come back. Would you like to help me fill the feeder, Tommy? I think I saw some of your old favorite seeds in the shed." Tommy's fingers paused their counting. His eyes met Martha's for the first time in months. 1 cup of sunflower seeds, 2 scoops of millet, 3 handfuls of safflower, he recited, remembering the mixture they used to prepare together. "That's right," Martha smiled, feeling the expression crack through months of disuse. "Exactly right. Would you like to help me make it now?" Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. But the exposure risk, the distance protocols. Martha looked down at her soil-covered hands, then at Tom's journal lying open beside her. The page it had fallen to contained one of his favorite quotes. "A garden is proof that you believe in tomorrow." "We'll be careful," Martha said, rising slowly to her feet. "We'll wear masks, keep our distance. But maybe it's time to start believing in tomorrow again." She looked at the cardinal pair, still watching from their perch. The birds came back after all. Tommy was already moving toward the shed, his steps purposeful, fingers counting out an excited rhythm. 1 cup of sunflower seeds, he repeated. 2 scoops of millet. Martha caught a glimpse of movement from the corner of her eye. Mrs. Chun had emerged from her house and was standing at her own garden gate, one hand resting on the latch. Mr. Peterson had paused his mail collection, leaning on his cane, watching. Even Kevin, the delivery boy, had slowed his usual hurried pace as he passed the house. Something was stirring in Millbrook Heights, something that had nothing to do with viruses or vaccines, protocols or prescriptions. Something that smelled like damp earth and hope, like memory and possibility. Martha picked up Tom's journal and tucked it securely in her pocket. There would be time later to read through his plans, to imagine how to adapt them for this new world they found themselves in. For now, there were birds to feed, a child to teach, and a garden waiting to heal. "Coming, Tommy," she called, reaching for a spare pair of gardening gloves. "Let's see if we remember how to make the birds feel welcome." Behind her, the overgrown garden seemed to whisper with possibility, like a classroom on the first day of school. Full of challenges, yes, but also ripe with the promise of growth and discovery. Martha felt something she hadn't experienced in 18 months. The flutter of excitement in her chest had nothing to do with anxiety, and everything to do with purpose. The next few days unfolded like pages in a story Martha hadn't known she was writing. Each morning, precisely at 9:15 a.m., 15 minutes before his online therapy session, Tommy would appear at the garden gate, his fingers dancing their familiar counting pattern, but his eyes increasingly focused on the growing changes in the Wilson backyard. "5 roses need pruning," he announced one morning, surprising Martha with both his observation and his initiative. 3 have black spot. 2 are healthy. His precise categorization reminded her of the way he used to organize reading materials in her classroom. Everything in its proper place, everything counted and accounted for. "That's very observant, Tommy," Martha replied, maintaining their careful distance while adjusting her mask. She'd found that gardening with masks was challenging. The fabric would dampen with breath and soil would stick to it. But somehow that seemed a small price to pay for these moments of connection. Sarah watched from her porch, coffee cup clutched in her hands, dark circles under her eyes testament to another long hospital shift. But there was something new in her expression. A spark of hope, perhaps, as she watched her son engage with the world in a way he hadn't since the pandemic began. "He's sleeping better," Sarah confided one afternoon, keeping her voice low as Tommy methodically cleared a patch of ground for what he had deemed the counting garden. "The nightmares about numbers that don't add up, they're less frequent now. His therapist says having a physical space to apply his patterns is therapeutic." Martha nodded, remembering how her classroom's reading garden had served a similar purpose for countless students over the years. "Nature has its own patterns," she said, watching Tommy carefully space out seedlings in perfect rows of 5. "Sometimes we just need help seeing them." The transformation wasn't limited to Tommy. Mrs. Chun, who had spent months hurrying past with barely a glance, began lingering at her fence during her daily mail collection. One morning, she cleared her throat softly. "Those peonies," she said, pointing to a tangled mass of stems Martha had been struggling to identify. "Tiny dividing. I have some experience with that." Martha looked up, soil streaking her gardening gloves. "Tom always said you were the peony whisperer of Millbrook Heights." Mrs. Chen's eyes crinkled above her mask, the first smile Martha had seen from her in over a year. "He was kind man, always shared his tomatoes." She hesitated, then added, "I have seeds from my grandmother's garden in Shanghai. They should not go to waste." The interaction sparked something that had been dormant in Martha's teacher's heart. That afternoon, she dug out her old lesson planning notebook and began to write. Asterisk project, Community Healing Garden. Objectives: create safe, distanced gardening spaces. Incorporate elements for sensory integration for Tommy. Heritage plant section, Mrs. Chen's seeds. Memorial Torner, Toms Roses. Accessible raised beds, Mr. Peterson's arthritis. Resources: Tom's tools. Community knowledge. Existing plants. Hope unlimited supply, asterisk. She smiled at the last item, recognizing her old teaching optimism seeping back into her planning style. The next morning brought an unexpected collaboration. Mr. Peterson, watching Tommy's methodical garden work, called out from his fence. "Young man," he said, his accountant's precision evident even in casual conversation, "I notice you're calculating plant spacing without proper tools." Tommy's fingers paused their counting as he looked up, uncertain. "I have something that might help." Mr. Peterson disappeared into his garage and returned with a measuring wheel, the kind used by surveyors. "My son left it here last spring. It counts the exact distance between points." Tommy's eyes widened at the word counts. Sarah, watching from her usual spot, pressed her hand to her heart. Martha saw the moment's potential. "Tommy," she said carefully, "would you like to be in charge of garden measurements?" His response was to walk directly to Mr. Peterson's fence, closer than he'd gotten to anyone outside his family in months, and accept the measuring wheel with trembling hands. 1 inch, 2 inches, 3 inches, he began, rolling it carefully along the garden's edge. The garden began to take on a life of its own. Mrs. Chen's heritage seeds were planted in a special section that Tommy had measured to precise specifications. Mr. Peterson's measuring wheel helped create perfectly spaced rows that satisfied both Tommy's need for order and Martha's vision for accessibility. Word spread through the neighborhood's newly revived grapevine. Kevin, the young delivery driver, mentioned it to his grandmother, who turned out to be a master composter. She began leaving carefully labeled bags of premium compost by Martha's gate. The local garden center, hearing about the project through one of their retired employees who lived on the street, donated several raised bed kits. But it was the arrival of Lisa Zhang, Mrs. Chen's granddaughter, that truly catalyzed the transformation. A graduate student in horticultural therapy, Lisa had been studying remotely from her apartment in the city. When her grandmother mentioned the growing community project, she immediately saw its potential. "This is exactly what my thesis is about," she exclaimed during a masked and distanced visit to the garden. "The therapeutic applications of community gardening in post-traumatic recovery. Would you mind if I documented this?" Martha looked around at what their little garden had become. Tommy meticulously measuring spaces for new plants, Mr. Peterson sketching efficient watering systems, Mrs. Chun demonstrating proper peony division techniques to an attentive audience of neighbors, all properly distanced. Sarah actually sitting down for once, watching her son work with tears of joy in her eyes. "Document away," Martha replied. "But make sure you note that the real therapy started when we stopped counting the things we couldn't do and started counting the things we could grow instead." Lisa's presence added a new dimension to the project. Her knowledge of therapeutic gardening techniques helped Martha design spaces that served multiple purposes. A sensory garden that helped Tommy process overwhelming emotions, raised beds at perfect heights for those with mobility issues, quiet corners for meditation and grief processing. The garden became a living classroom, but unlike any Martha had taught in before. Here, everyone was both student and teacher. Mrs. Chun taught traditional Chinese planting techniques. Mr. Peterson applied his accountant's precision to creating maintenance schedules, and Tommy became their unofficial quality control expert, his attention to detail ensuring every measurement, every pattern, every sequence was perfect. One afternoon, as Martha was helping Tommy set up a new butterfly feeding station, she heard a sound that had been absent from Millbrook Heights for far too long. Laughter. Real, unreserved laughter. Mrs. Chun was demonstrating to a small group how her grandmother used to dance through the garden to bless the new plantings, her movements graceful despite her age. Even through their masks, the joy was unmistakable. "Martha," Sarah called softly from her usual watching spot. "Look at this." She held up her phone, showing a chart from Tommy's therapy sessions. The line tracking his anxiety levels showed a clear downward trend, correlating perfectly with the days he'd spent in the garden. "Numbers don't lie," Mr. Peterson commented from his spot by the rose trellis, his accountant's heart appreciating the data. "This garden, it's healing more than just the plants." Martha touched the worn cover of Tom's journal in her pocket, thinking of his unfinished plans and how they'd evolved into something even more beautiful than he might have imagined. The garden had become a living metaphor for their community's recovery, messy, imperfect, but growing stronger every day. 5 butterflies, Tommy announced suddenly, his measuring wheel temporarily forgotten as he watched the colorful visitors explore the new feeding station. 5 butterflies, Miss Martha, like your classroom reading groups. Martha felt tears well up in her eyes. It was the first time he'd mentioned her classroom, the first indication that he remembered that time before everything changed. But more than that, it was the way he said it. Not just counting, but connecting, finding patterns that linked past joy to present hope. "Yes, Tommy," she said softly, watching as more neighbors gathered at the garden's edge, drawn by the afternoon's gentle activity. "Just like reading groups. And you know what? I think we're all learning something new here, every single day." The garden hummed with life, not just the plants and insects, but the humankind as well. Each person properly distanced but undeniably connected, bound together by something stronger than fear, more enduring than isolation. They were growing more than just plants. They were growing community, hope, and healing, one carefully measured garden bed at a time. The story of the Millbrook Heights Healing Garden might have remained a quiet local miracle, if not for Dr. Anderson's unexpected visit one crisp autumn afternoon. He had come to check on Martha, concerned by her missed appointments and unfilled prescriptions. What he found stopped him in his tracks. Where there had once been an overgrown reminder of loss, a vibrant tapestry of life now flourished. The garden had evolved into a series of carefully designed spaces, each with its own purpose and personality. But it wasn't just the physical transformation that caught his attention, it was the people. "Martha," he called out, his professional demeanor momentarily forgotten as he took in the scene before him. "What's happening here?" Martha looked up from where she was helping Tommy label a new batch of seedlings. Her hands were dirt-stained, her mask slightly askew, but her eyes held a clarity he hadn't seen in their previous sessions. "We're growing hope, Doctor," she replied simply. "Would you like a tour?" The tour began in what Tommy had dubbed the counting garden. 5 perfectly spaced rows of herbs, each row containing exactly 15 plants. "Tommy designed this section," Martha explained. "He's teaching us about sacred geometry in nature. Did you know that many plants follow the Fibonacci sequence in their growth patterns?" Dr. Anderson watched as Tommy demonstrated his measuring technique to a small group of masked observers, his movements confident, his voice clear. This was the same boy whose mother had consulted him about increasing anxiety medications just months ago. They moved to the heritage section, where Mrs. Chun was carefully tending to plants that carried stories from across oceans and generations. "These are more than just flowers," the elderly woman explained, her previous reticence replaced by quiet pride. "They are my grandmother's memories, now growing in American soil." The doctor's clinical gaze softened as he observed the careful interactions between neighbors, all masked, all distanced, but undeniably connected. His notepad remained untouched in his pocket as Martha led him through the garden's various therapeutic spaces. "The anxiety you diagnosed," Martha said quietly, pausing by Tom's restored rose garden, "it hasn't gone away. But here, among the growing things, it feels more manageable. The garden gives us something bigger than our fears to focus on." Dr. Anderson's response was interrupted by the arrival of Lisa Zhang, laptop in hand, excitement visible even behind her mask. "Mrs. Wilson, the Journal of Horticultural Therapy wants to feature our garden in their next issue. They're particularly interested in the integration of traditional cultural practices with modern therapeutic techniques." The news spread through the garden like sunshine breaking through clouds. Mrs. Chun clasped her hands in joy. Mr. Peterson began calculating the potential impact on community property values. Once an accountant, always an accountant. And Tommy celebrated by taking exactly 5 measurements of his favorite flower bed. But it was Sarah's arrival that truly marked the day's significance. Still in her hospital scrubs, She rushed into the garden with uncharacteristic urgency. "The hospital board heard about what's happening here," she announced, slightly breathless. "They're interested in implementing something similar for their long-term COVID recovery patients." Dr. Anderson turned to Martha, his expression thoughtful. "You've created something remarkable here, Martha. This isn't just a garden, it's a model for community healing." "I didn't create it," Martha corrected gently. "We all did. Every person who faced their fears to plant a seed, every neighbor who shared their knowledge, every child who found peace among the flowers. We built this together." The doctor pulled out his prescription pad, but instead of writing a prescription, he began taking notes about the garden's design. "Would you be willing to consult with our hospital's therapeutic recreation department? What you've achieved here, it's more effective than many of our traditional interventions." Martha felt a familiar flutter in her chest, but this time it wasn't anxiety. It was purpose. She glanced at Tom's journal, now well-worn from constant reference and additions. "I think," she said slowly, "Tom would have liked that. He always said a garden should keep growing." The garden had indeed grown beyond anyone's expectations. Local news stations began featuring it in their community segments. Other neighborhoods requested guidance on starting their own healing gardens. Lisa's thesis evolved into a broader study of community-based recovery models. But it was the smaller transformations that meant the most to Martha. The way Tommy now used his counting to help others measure and plant. The sound of Mrs. Chun humming traditional songs as she taught younger neighbors about lunar planting cycles. The sight of Mr. Peterson teaching basic accounting to a group of teenagers who had started a seedling business. One evening, as the autumn sun painted the garden in golden hues, Martha received an unexpected video call. It was Michael, her son in Seattle, and he wasn't alone. His entire horticultural therapy class at the university was with him, eager to learn about the garden that was becoming a case study in community healing. "Mom," Michael said, his voice carrying a mixture of pride and regret, "why didn't you tell me what you were building? This is revolutionary." Martha touched the screen gently, remembering all the calls she hadn't made, the isolation she had chosen. "I didn't know myself at first," she admitted. "I just knew I had to do something with the pain." "Mrs. Wilson," Tommy called from the butterfly garden, his voice cutting through her moment of reflection. "Look, 5 monarch butterflies, 3 painted ladies, and 2 swallowtails. It's a perfect 10. The garden had achieved its own perfect balance. A place where numbers brought comfort instead of anxiety, where distance didn't preclude connection, where grief could coexist with growth. Dr. Anderson's prescription pad remained in his pocket, replaced by a small trowel Tommy had insisted he needed for proper garden measurements. As the day drew to a close, Martha watched her neighbors gradually disperse, each carrying something from the garden: fresh herbs, new knowledge, peace of mind. Sarah lingered behind, watching Tommy make his final measurements of the day. "You know," Sarah said softly, "his therapist says she's never seen such progress. It's not just the counting anymore. He's learning to adapt when things don't fit his patterns. Yesterday, he helped replant a row that got damaged in the storm, even though it meant changing his perfect measurements." Martha remembered a similar breakthrough with a student years ago, how the right environment could make all the difference in a child's development. "Gardens are good teachers," she replied. "They show us that sometimes the most beautiful growth comes from unexpected disruptions." The setting sun cast long shadows across the garden, creating patterns that Tommy immediately began to measure. But now his counting was accompanied by observations, connections, and sometimes even laughter, sounds as healing as any medicine. Martha sat on the bench Tom had built years ago, his journal open on her lap. The latest entry wasn't about plant care or garden design. It was a list of lives touched, hopes renewed, community restored. Dr. Anderson's words echoed in her mind. This wasn't just a garden, it was a model for healing. Above her, the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. The garden settled into its evening rhythm. Crickets tuning their instruments, night-blooming flowers preparing their debut, healing continuing in ways both seen and unseen. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new growth, new opportunities to learn and heal. But for now, in this moment, Martha simply sat and listened to the garden's evening symphony, remembering Tom's words. Every garden is a story of hope written in soil and sunlight. Their garden had become more than just a story of hope. It was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the healing power of community. And somewhere, she was sure, Tom was smiling at how his unfinished garden plans had blossomed into something far more beautiful than anyone could have imagined. 1 year after Martha first reopened Tom's garden shed, Millbrook Heights gathered for what had become their monthly Garden of Hope celebration. The autumn air was crisp with possibility, carrying the sweet scent of late-blooming roses and herb-infused memories. Martha stood at the entrance of what was now officially recognized as the Millbrook Heights Community Healing Garden, reading the small bronze plaque that had been installed just last week. In memory of Thomas Wilson, every garden is a story of hope written in soil and sunlight. Founded 2024, a place of healing, growth, and community renewal, the garden had evolved beyond anyone's wildest dreams. What had started as one woman's journey through grief had blossomed into a model for community healing that was being studied and replicated across the country. But more importantly, it had become home to countless small miracles. Miss Marha, Tommy's voice, clear and confident, called from the sensory garden. The new therapy group is here. Martha turned to see a small group of COVID long haulers being welcomed by Sarah, now the hospital's official liaison for their garden therapy program. Each visitor wore a name tag with a number, Tommy's idea, helping them feel ordered and secure in this new environment. "Welcome to our garden," Martha said, easily slipping into her teacher's voice. "Here, we measure healing not in medical charts, but in flowers bloomed and friendships formed." Mrs. Chun emerged from her Heritage Garden section, where she now taught weekly classes on traditional Chinese herbalism and cultural gardening practices. Her grandson Kevin, no longer just a delivery driver, had helped her create a popular YouTube channel sharing her wisdom with a global audience. "Today we have special celebration," Mrs. Chun announced, her previous shyness long forgotten. "My granddaughter Lisa's research paper about our garden has been published in International Journal." The news was met with enthusiastic applause from the gathered community. Lisa, who had completed her PhD and now ran the garden's research program, blushed behind her mask. Her work had helped secure grants that would ensure the garden's future for years to come. Mr. Peterson, armed with his ever-present measuring wheel, now decorated with colorful stickers courtesy of Tommy, began his usual tour for newcomers. The garden operates at a 137% efficiency rate compared to traditional therapy programs, he announced proudly, somehow making statistics sound warm and hopeful. "And it costs significantly less than conventional treatments," Dr. Anderson added, having become one of the garden's strongest advocates in the medical community. His prescription pad had gathered dust in his pocket, replaced by referral forms for the garden's various programs. Martha watched as Tommy led his own group of young visitors, children on the autism spectrum who had struggled with the pandemic's disruption. 5 steps to the butterfly garden, he explained, his measuring wheel creating parallel lines in the soil. 3 types of flowers that attract monarchs. 2 benches for watching and counting. Sarah appeared at Martha's side, no longer wearing her hospital scrubs. She had transitioned to running the hospital's new horticultural therapy department full-time. "Sometimes I still can't believe it," she said softly. "Remember when we were all afraid to leave our houses?" "The garden remembers," Martha replied, touching a rose bush that Tom had planted decades ago. "It holds our stories, our fears, our healing." The afternoon unfolded like a well-loved book, each page filled with moments of connection and growth. Michael, who had finally moved back from Seattle to help expand the garden program, was teaching a group about sustainable urban farming. His environmental science students from the local community college were scattered throughout the garden, learning lessons that no classroom could contain. "Mom," he called out, waving Martha over to a patch of soil where he was demonstrating companion planting. "Tell them about how this all started." Martha looked at the eager faces turned toward her, seeing in them the same hunger for connection that had brought her to the garden a year ago. She pulled Tom's journal from her pocket, now accompanied by several others, filled with notes from their growing community of healers and helpers. "It started with loss," she began, her voice steady and strong, "but it grew into something else entirely. You see, gardens have a secret to share with us." As she spoke, sharing the story they all knew but never tired of hearing, Martha noticed small movements around the garden. Mrs. Chun adjusting a plant support with practiced hands. Tommy measuring the distance between new seedlings with perfect precision. Mr. Peterson updating his meticulous records of the garden's impact. Dr. Anderson discussing plant properties with a group of medical students. Sarah hugging a parent whose child had just spoken their first full sentence among the flowers. The garden had become more than a place. It was a living, breathing testament to the power of community, the strength of hope, and the endless possibilities of growth. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across their flourishing sanctuary, Martha felt a familiar presence beside her. In the golden light, she could almost see Tom standing there, his gardening hat tilted at that characteristic angle, his proud smile warming her heart. "Look what we grew, Tom," she whispered. Tommy's voice cut through her reverie. "Miss Martha, it's time for the butterfly release." The monthly tradition had become a community favorite. Each person who had found healing in the garden was invited to release a butterfly, a living symbol of transformation and hope. As the colorful wings took flight, Martha watched her community, no longer separated by fear or isolation, but united in this space of healing and hope. The prescriptions that had once cluttered her kitchen counter had been replaced by seed packets and garden plans. The anxiety that had once confined her to her house had transformed into the excitement of welcoming new people to their growing family. 5 butterflies going east, Tommy announced happily. 3 going west, 2 staying to visit the purple coneflowers. Perfect counting, Tommy, Martha smiled, remembering how numbers had once been his prison rather than his joy. As darkness settled over the garden, small solar lights began to twinkle. Another of Tommy's carefully planned additions, ensuring the garden remained a beacon of hope even after sunset. The community lingered, reluctant to leave their sanctuary, sharing stories and plans for tomorrow. Martha made one final walk through the paths she and Tom had once tended together. The garden hummed with life, not just the plants and insects, but the invisible threads of connection that had transformed a neighborhood of strangers into a family of healers. She paused at the new meditation corner, where a small plaque displayed words from Tom's journal. "In every garden, there's a tomorrow waiting to bloom. And look at our tomorrow, Tom," she whispered to the evening air. "Look how beautifully it grew." The Millbrook Heights Community Healing Garden had become more than a response to isolation and loss. It had grown into a promise for the future, a living reminder that even in the darkest soil, hope takes root and blooms. When asked about her proud vision for the garden's future, Martha's answer was always the same. "We're not just growing plants here. We're growing hope, healing, and community. And there's always room for more of that to bloom." The garden's story, like the best kind of hope, continues to grow. Have you ever experienced the healing power of a garden or community? Maybe you've witnessed a small act of kindness grow into something bigger, or found hope in unexpected places like Martha did. Share your story of healing and connection in the comments below. What seeds of hope could you plant in your community today? Remember, sometimes the most beautiful gardens grow from the smallest beginnings.